My name is Sunil. Senile, I've been called that before. So I work in the customer success organization. Maybe some of you know TJ Randall. Yep, so TJ is my boss. I'm responsible for what we call post-sales activities, right? So after you buy the products and you get them implemented, I'm the guy that comes in and says, how's things going? I shake babies and kiss hands. Okay. Some of you got the reference, right? All right, so, but the idea here is that there's continuity, right? We don't want to just sell you the product and say, all right, go do your thing. The idea there is that we, as partners, are maintaining a relationship and that you're getting what you want out of our products, okay? I speak at events. I talk to customers, just like you guys. And I try to influence you to buy more stuff. No, actually, that's not my job. But so why numbers, right? Why metrics? Why is that so important to your organization? You can build the biggest, baddest pipeline, delivery pipeline, and if you don't have numbers to quantify that, how do you justify that to your boss? Because if your boss says, well, I gave you $1 million to buy the software, what is your throughput, right? And if you can't tell me how many successful builds you had, or how many successful deployments you had, or failures for that matter, I'm not getting the biggest bang for my buck as your manager or as your executive, right? And I'll find other alternatives until I get that. From a technical perspective, it really doesn't matter, right? As a developer, I just want to push code as fast as I can. And I'll automate and I'll do what I need to do to get it out there. But where does the buck lie? How many of you are managers and executives? Most of you, right? In fact, I think all of you are. And at the end of the day, you want to know how much money you're spending, right, or not spending, and what your ROI is, okay? So keep that in mind. So metrics is everything. Only when something is measured can it be improved, right? And often deciding what to measure is the most critical piece. So I'm going to ask you this question, right? In your organization today, how many of you would count yourself as in the planning phase, as a work in progress, or extremely well established metrics gathering system or tool or team? Out of those three, you're in the planning phase, 25%, a work in progress, probably most of you, right? And then well established. Even one? No. See? So, and that is, yeah, who cares about metrics, right? Well, that's the point, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that everybody wants them, but how do you actually start? That's the key, right? And that's exactly what it is. Deciding what to measure is the most critical piece. So to really start off, you have to really decide what are the things that encompasses a metric, right? It needs to be easily measurable. It needs to be directly correlated to business performance, okay? It needs to be predictive of future business performance. It needs to be isolated, or at least be able to be isolated, and comparable to competition. We'll go through each one of these briefly. So easily measurable, right? Like, think about all the things that you do in terms of deploying your applications. And what are the quantifiable pieces of information when you deploy that application? Was it deployed successfully? So it's yes or no, 1 or 0, right? There's no gray area in this case. So you want to make your pipeline a data-driven decision-making system, right? It's a loaded word, right? Data-driven decision-making system, right? But that's exactly what you want. It's a 1 or a 0. It's successful or not. When you start gathering those KPIs, you guys have heard what KPIs are, right? You start really getting a feel for how your system is performing. So easily measurable, directly correlated to business performance. Again, this goes back to the same thing, and I'm going to try and get the message across. It's a business thing. It's not a technical thing. Okay, every time you start looking at metrics, it's not about the developer, because I know he wants to push code as fast as possible, right? And if he can't do it, he's going to script it out or go around the system to try and do that. But the metrics are really for the people above the chain, right? As you climb the chain, those metrics get even more and more relevant, okay? So the metrics should be tied to business-oriented goals for the department or the group, the community, or the company as a whole, okay? And the right metric will tell you if you're successfully executing the basics, the fundamentals. A predictive nature of future business performance. What does that mean, really, right? So you start gathering these metrics, and then you'll do that for 5 months in a row, and then what? Now, what do you do with that, right? What is your end goal? Do you want to get, let's just take automation, right? Today, how many of you actually use Excel Release and the dashboards in Excel Release? Right? One of those is you see the amount of automation, right? And out of that, you can actually tell which parts of your releases are manual, right? And your goal is to get 100% automation. That's that predictive future business performance. You want to get to that 100% automation, right? So using those metrics to get there is actually important. Those dashboards look beautiful. They look pretty, right? But if you're not using them, what's the point, right? Let's see here. Isolated. How do you isolate these things? So you start off slow, and the idea here is that you want to measure all these things. You might have 30 different tools in your DevOps tool chain. That includes Excel Release and Excel Deploy, right? And you want to measure the throughput in each and every tool. That's great. But you've got to start slow. Start in some isolated fashion, right? Where you're starting to just maybe measure the number of successful releases to production. Who cares about test and dev, right? When you start doing these deployments and you realize that you deploy to your test environment. How many times do you deploy to your test environment? Multiple times before somebody signs off and says, all right, we're ready to go to production, right? So reduce the metrics and hone in on those, isolate them, and really pick on them until you get that right, because that becomes your model for the rest of the KPIs that you start gathering, okay? And competition, comparable to competition. Why? Who thinks that metrics are just related to your little organization or company? Right? Everybody's shaking their head because it is absolutely crucial to be watching over your shoulder. Your competition is catching up, right? And if you're not delivering your apps to production or in some reduced time to market, your competition is catching up faster. It's going to overtake you at some point, right? So be aware. And your competition could be inside the company. It's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean that it's outside. You can have, I've been there. I've seen this happen in companies where one division of a company has their pipeline built using the XebiaLabs toolset, right? And then another function, they're doing everything in AWS, so they don't really care about anything else going on. So they're accelerating. The problem there is they have no metrics, right? Because they're using all AWS tools, and to build any sort of metrics dashboard, they have to go out and build it. They have to spend the money, get somebody to program, a couple of programmers, right? Test it, build it, test it, build it. Over time, that adds up. Now you have this one function here that's doing stuff really fast because it's all AWS, great. And then this other one's a little slower. But the AWS guys are just barreling, and who gets the credit? The AWS guys, because they're delivering faster, right? So you have to kind of balance that and watch what's happening. You kind of have to cover all aspects of your organization, competition or not. So how many of you guys know this guy? That's Dave Farley. He wrote Continuous Delivery with Gene Kim. All right, he was actually at our last summit. He was scratching his head. Spoke with him for a little bit. And he says, focus on bringing down your cycle time, all right? The rest will naturally flow. This is a guy who's been working in DevOps. They call him the father of DevOps, actually, even before Gene Kim. So maybe that's why he still has some hair and I don't. I don't know. That was a joke. All right, so two phases in, we've broken this down into two major phases in the DevOps journey. Phase one being the automation and optimization phase, and phase two is the digital enterprise phase. We'll talk a little bit about the digital enterprise phase. You guys, how many of you have heard the term digital transformation? A lot of you have, right? Every company, most companies have done the agile transformation. Then they've gone to the DevOps transformation, and then some exec came by and said, hey, we're going to do the digital transformation. What does that mean, right? And how do they actually achieve the digital transformation? What's that?
So we're doing them all at once.
You didn't know? Some companies do, right? It depends on how you approach the problem. But the idea of phase one is really being good at the process of software delivery. It's that basic automation and delivery of your software and optimizing that. Phase two is really how do you digitize the enterprise with your metrics. And technically, when you look at it from an executive perspective and they say digital transformation, they're asking you, what can we do to improve our processes, right? And how do I know as an exec that we're actually improving our digitization of the organization, right?
So give me metrics.
So give me metrics. That's it. You're getting it, right? So what are the two phases here? So if you look at this purely from these are two dashboards that you see in Excel release. One is showing you what we call a DevOps dashboard. The other one's a digital enterprise dashboard. One is distilling your metrics down for each release, okay? And we look at automation, or we look at the number of Jira tickets, for example, that are in that release, or you might be looking at the amount of automation in that one release. But you distill that up to a higher scale. Now you're starting to look at releases across maybe domains, right? Multiple business functions. How many times did we deliver, an application to production, and how many times was it successful? That kind of stuff. That's a higher level abstraction of those same metrics. Okay. So let's talk about the DevOps dashboard. You heard Gene Kim talk about the mean time to release, MTTR. He talked a little bit about code deployment lead time. We'll talk about that here just in a second here. So time to delivery. What do you measure? How long does it take on average to get code from development to production? Right. That was what Gene Kim just addressed, right, through what he called code deployment lead time. Excellent metric. Like, how much time is it taking as soon as a developer checks in his code, right? Now, why is that important? Who can tell me? Anybody? Okay, bring out the alcohol. We need to get this party started. You can tell what's on my mind right now. I need to go party.
A little more time.
A little bit more. Okay, I'll wait until, what is it, 5? No, but the point I'm trying to make is the time to delivery is critical because you want to measure how long it takes to get your code the minute a developer checks in his or her code, right? Because if I'm a developer and I check in my code now and I don't see it in production for 6 months, I don't even know what I've done at that point, right? And so the ability to see things move fast, whether it's through automation, whatever it may be, but to see my code go to production in a short time frame is absolutely important. So measuring that lead time to delivery is absolutely crucial, okay?
Well, and the learning, like Gene Kim was talking about, the learning from mistakes or whatever.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. So I've always said, learn from experience, learn from failure, right? Because if you don't fail, you're not learning. The more you fail, the more you learn, the more you'll figure out how to improve your automation, how to improve your gathering techniques, your metrics gathering techniques, okay?
Can I ask a clarifying
Sure.
question on that? So you mentioned if there was one developer, but what if there's a team, say, of 10 developers?
Hundreds.
Hundreds, and just trying to get the point where the actual point where you'd start the clock, is it that everybody's done with their unit testing and it's ready for integration testing?
That's a good point, right? So if you remember what Gene said, a lot of corporations say we'll start our code deployment lead time as soon as the code is ready to go to test. Now that's okay, right? But really the process should start as soon as the code is checked in. And that's even before it's gone to the development integration environments. Okay?
So this is really a story level metric.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
It would depend on what the definition of done is in your.
Yeah. So it's an iterative approach, right? You check in code, you'll see it iterate many times, right? Even during that one iteration, you'll see that code go to the development integration environment multiple times. But that's okay. It's a viable metric, right? Because you can say, all right, I know I had 10 check-ins to my development environment, of which only 3 were successful. Why is that, right? Or I had 10 check-ins and 9 were successful. That's awesome, because now we know that things are going to test a whole lot faster, right? Little things like that make a big impact, okay? Deployment frequency. How many of you actually use deployment frequency metrics? Nobody cares. So then this actually, let me turn that around. What is your deployment frequency? She's shrugging her shoulders like, I don't know.
If we don't measure it, we don't know.
Yeah, exactly, right? Go ahead.
Well, deployment frequency is only useful if tied to testing. Because why deploy every 5 minutes if you're deploying crap?
Well, but the point is that if you have, let's take the notion of microservices, right? What is a microservice? It's some stateless application architecture, right? And the idea behind a microservice is that make a small change, I should be able to take that little microservice and deploy it all the way to production. Now, if the change keeps failing in test, that's a good metric to grab, isn't it? Because now I know that something's going on before it even goes to production, right?
It also highlights that the developer's not doing their proper testing.
Code quality.
Code quality is not being adhered to.
Absolutely.
Or being used or being ignored.
Yep, absolutely.
So you can get a little big brother on that.
Yep,
So,
exactly my point, right?
what is the maximum frequency you can deal with for turnaround time?
It all boils down to also like what your application architecture is, right? If you had 500 applications and you could only deploy all 500 once a year, right? You're going to see a whole lot more deployments to test environment, but only one deployment to production. That is, if all the stars align and everybody's breathing the same way, and there are no babies being born or shook, or you know what I'm getting at, right? So a bad analogy is terrible, but but you know what I'm getting at. Okay, I think the point is that it doesn't matter which environment you're deploying to or releasing to, the metrics should be the same, right? Deployment frequency, development, test, stage, QA, production have the same KPIs across the board, across the pipeline. Okay? Change volume. You just hit the nail on the, how many user stories are being deployed in a release, right? How complex are those changes in the lines of code? How many of you actually measure lines of code in your software? What tools do you use to do that?
Either in-house tools or Sonar.
Sonar.
It's all,
Yep.
with COBOL, so you look at mainframe applications, it's
Yeah.
usually 10 or 20 times more code there.
Absolutely.
Mainframe than in the mid-range is.
Yeah.
Mid-range is.
And why is that important though? Why is the lines of code important when you look at quality?
Just the sheer time it takes to go through it.
To filter through it, right? Yep. The other statistic or the other metric is really when you start looking at lines of code, how do you determine what your tests are going to be, right? So if you had 1 million lines of code and you had only 2 tests, what does that tell you, right? So I'm not saying that 1 million lines of code should have 100 tests, but the point is, are your tests comprehensive enough to test the 1 million lines of code? Anyway, good metric to catch. And if you're not using code quality tools to measure your LOCs or your tests or your unit tests, etc., you should be doing that. Okay? Change volume. Time to recovery. We talked a little bit about mean time to release or mean time to recovery. It's what worked fine in dev. How many of you actually said it was just one line of code that changed in production? Yeah. Yeah, so
That's like the worst excuse ever.
So in the 90s, actually, when I had started working, one of the Agile teams brought up this idea of putting a big red light, So when something broke in production and it was a developer who had changed something, the red light went on, and it was the light of shame.
My son did that.
Yeah,
His company did that.
yeah. See, it's light of shame, right? And so we saw that this was kind of funny because the amount of problems that we used to have in production started to drop because nobody wanted to be in the light of shame.
Not only did
Right.
the light go up, but a spotlight would go on the person. It was written up in the
Wow.
Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, see, it's amazing what the mental effects are, right? So people are now more concerned about their quality because then they'll spend the time to do some unit testing, functional tests, write the tests before they actually put the code into test or production, right? So what does it tell you? It tells you there's quality in both your code and your process, right? Do you have configuration drift? How many of you deal with configuration problems most of the time when you do deployments? Drift. So that means pretty much app configurations, environment configurations, right? How many of you have had operations guys change infrastructure underneath your application infrastructure and not tell you?
We don't allow them to. We force them to define it ahead of time.
And then they're not allowed to change it, right? But how can you guarantee that they're not going to change it?
Because they don't do the deployments.
But they do manage your infrastructure.
They are not allowed to do that.
But how do you stop them from not doing that?
It's protected. They don't have access to the ID that does the deployment.
So your operations guys don't have access to production systems?
Not in that way, no. They can't change
Okay.
those things.
That's good. Security controls, right? It's what it's all about. Clear division of separation of duty. Perfect. But when you do have that sort of drift, it becomes a problem, right?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely is a problem. So how do you manage that? That's what this little bullet over here is trying to say. So you've got to be able to manage it in some form or fashion, whether it's the process. I've seen companies use Excel release to manage that, right? Where the templates actually go out and query the infrastructure, make sure nothing's changed, and then actually ask the ops guy or the infrastructure guy for a sign-off to ensure that they haven't changed anything, right? Even behind the scenes. So now there's auditability and traceability, right? Change volume. We talked a little bit about this. You know, how long do you take to recover from a failed change? I used to work at Digital Globe, and Tony Wilmer is going to have a talk. We'll attend that talk. It's awesome. He talks about actually maintaining your pipeline for a pipeline. So in other words, how do you maintain the integrity of your pipeline? Cool talk. We used to fail in production every single time. And the only way to fix the problem was to fail forward, not roll back, right? So in other words, if the DBAs made a change, the messaging business systems guys made a change, and the app guys threw their apps in and we all deployed and everybody was trying to be happy after a whole weekend's worth of work, right? Come to find out that there was some change that wasn't carried forward. So now we have to go back, reanalyze all the code, fix the problems in production, and then go back and change them in dev and test. And can you imagine the cost behind that, right? You've all heard that before. It actually costs you more to fail forward than to roll back. Okay, so change volumes. How long do you take to recover from a failed change? Does it take days, hours, minutes? Test it before it gets to production. What does it tell you? Can you respond rapidly? Response times varies, depends on the size of the company. And if you have division of duty, that becomes even more problemsome, right? Any questions before we go to the digital enterprise dashboard? All right, so actually go back one. So this one is actually near and dear to my heart because I deal with adoption, happiness. How happy are you? And I don't mean just because you're using XebiaLabs products, right? You should be smiling, doing the happy dance. Business impact and cultural impact. All important things because at the end of the day, the executive is asking, I bought 250 user licenses of this product. How many user licenses are you using, right? And you said, well, I kind of underestimated. We're going to actually go to 500 users because of the acquisition you made, right? And although we have 250 user licenses, right now we're only using 100, even though I'm trying to foresee the future, right? And the business exec is going to go, well, you're only using 100. Why did we buy 250? And I don't care if we're going to go to 500 users in the next month. Not my problem. Because I, as an exec, I'm looking at today's numbers, right? So adoption is a huge factor, okay? Sobering statistics. I don't know why this slide is in here. Anyway, 2/3 of what's built is a waste. Is that true? How much of what you've built in a pipeline do you actually use? Good question, isn't it? Right? If you can't measure it, how are you going to tell? So, if a third says no impact on desired income, a third actually makes outcomes worse, and a third actually improves the outcomes. Obviously, you want to have either no impact or improve, but not have a negative impact, right? Adoption and use, thank you. What do you measure? Traffic, calls to APIs, new user signups. What is going on? I thought somebody was back there. You think so? Wow. It's the passion. Come on, folks. It's the passion. But there's so many other things, right, that you can measure adoption. When we say traffic, it's really, you might have a 200 user license for XLR, but you're only using 50. But how do you actually measure how many times those 50 users have actually logged in, right? It's traffic to your applications, traffic to your pipeline. Absolutely important stuff, especially when you have to start writing the checks. What it tells you is a feature of or functionality being used. It's true, right? You end up buying products and you start seeing a lot of functionality being added, but you end up using 20% of the product only because it's doing that 20% that you started off with, right? And you're not interested in expanding your technology, tool chest. So you're happy with it because you've addressed that one piece and that's it. You're done. Your job is done, right? But if you really look and start digging, it's like having that toolbox, right? You have 100 tools in there and you only use a screwdriver and a hammer and a plier, maybe a cutter, right? But in there you've got your socket sets, you've got Allen wrenches, and you've got so many other tools that you rarely use, right? Same concept. Happiness. To me, like when I look at calls coming in from you guys and I start looking at that support ticket volume go up, my first call is to the target customer and say, hey, what's going on? Why are you guys experiencing, such high support issues? And sometimes it could be as simple as, well, we've just got a lot of users using the system. I'm like, yes, right? But sometimes it's because they're adopting a new feature and they have no idea, so they're asking for support. All good stuff. Sometimes it's negative, right? But the idea is I'm measuring happiness by the volume of tickets that we're getting. So I'm not saying that this is the right metric to gather, but you all have customers, whether it's internal or external, right, that might be using your pipeline or might be using the software that you guys sell. But the idea there is you start capturing this metric and you'll start figuring out whether customers are actually using your software or not. Okay? Quantitative. How many of you know what NPS stands for? So that? Net Promoter Score. Close. So the Net Promoter Score really is a combination of different KPIs, but what that actually tells me is that's my happiness score. That really is, right? So if I'm looking at how a customer is using our software, the amount of support tickets they've put in, the amount of features that they've adopted, right? Or they bought additional user licenses, that Net Promoter Score is going up. It's a significant metric, especially in the customer success arena. Tells you, are you being successful? Is the change delivering value? Okay. Business impact. How are your metrics, the things that you're measuring, impacting the business? Okay, because if I can measure how many times I tied my shoelace in the last 10 years. Does it matter to anybody else? Right? That's a bad analogy, but you guys get what I'm trying to get at. Right? So what you measure is absolutely important. All right? Trial conversions, the churn. These are all things mostly that impact the business as opposed to the technical side. But it is because you are all in a software business, right? You're here because you're doing something with software automation in your organization. Okay. Cultural impact. What you measure. How many of you manage people? Most of you, right? And some of you not only have teams local, some of you manage people globally, right? And the staff turnover leads to morale, leads to less usage, leads to, less adoption of your pipeline. These are all metrics that could potentially be valuable, especially when your exec asks you, what's going on? Why are you losing 5 people? Well, we bought Jenkins. People don't like Jenkins. Or, exec X decided to replace Excel release with Electric Cloud. I don't know. Just making up stuff here, But you get my point. It's important, all right? Metrics are important. Figure out what you have to start measuring and start small, all right? Oh, that was the last one. I'm going to go back here. Actually, here. So, questions?
So would that be kind of like in the past quarter or past year, all those metrics, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so if you're not gathering anything, it really doesn't matter, right, at this point. It starts somewhere. Most people would like to start gathering metrics for a quarter to make them really valuable. And then over time, as you gather quarter by quarter, you'll see that you'll have a trend, right? And then you start using that trend to figure out where you need to improve. But a quarter is a good starting point. Okay? Any other questions?
So we measure a lot of the individual products that are being developed. But we're now trying to combine those, and we're having a bit of trouble normalizing the values, because what means something to this project doesn't translate well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the challenges that we're
My approach with that is figure out which set of metrics kind of apply across the board, right? Because it's just like every functional area in your business, your company. Everybody wants to do their own thing, right? But at some point, somebody's going to say, you're tying your shoelace one way, I'm tying it the other way, but we're still tying our shoelaces, right? Figure out what the commonality is, and then start applying that across the board.